Most armies fight battles. The Soviet army fought systems. What separated them on the Eastern Front wasn't courage or equipment. It was something far more unsettling. They had figured out how to collapse an entire enemy force without ever defeating it in the traditional sense. They didn't just push Germans back. They erased coherence itself. By the time their offensives reached full momentum, enemy commanders were still issuing orders to units that no longer existed as functioning formations. This was deep battle doctrine, a Soviet concept that sounds academic until you see what it actually did. Traditional military thinking focused on the front line. Break through, push forward, repeat. The Soviets looked at warfare differently. They saw modern armies as interconnected systems. Frontline troops relied on artillery. Artillery relied on ammunition. Ammunition relied on supply lines. Supply lines relied on intact railways and functioning command posts. Sever enough connections and the system doesn't weaken gradually. It shatters all at once. Soviet theorists calculated something chilling before the war even began. Modern armies could only absorb concentrated shock for a limited window of time before internal coordination collapsed. Based on these pre-war studies, they designed offensives to penetrate 70 to 100 kilometers into enemy territory within days. Not weeks, days. That depth wasn't arbitrary. It was the distance required to reach beyond frontline defenses, past artillery positions, into the rear areas where command and logistics lived. Once those were threatened, battles stopped being about who held which trench. They became races against disintegration. The real proof came in 1944 during Operation Bagration. In 6 weeks, Germany lost roughly 28 divisions. Most weren't annihilated in heroic last stands. They were cut off, isolated, and rendered irrelevant while still technically combat capable. German commanders often believed they were holding their positions successfully. They had no idea their rear areas were already gone. Communications were severed. Supply routes didn't exist anymore. Reserves that should have arrived never came. By the time the truth became clear, there was no front line left to save. But deep battle was just the concept. Turning theory into reality required tools. The first and most devastating was massed artillery. By mid-war, Soviet planners had transformed artillery into the opening act of every major offensive. Before infantry moved, the battlefield was systematically dismantled. They concentrated thousands of guns into narrow sectors, sometimes reaching 200 to 300 artillery pieces per kilometre of front. That's not suppression fire, that's obliteration. The scale is what made it paralysing. During the opening of Operation Bagration, over 31,000 artillery pieces opened fire along breakthrough sectors. German communications shattered within minutes. Telephone lines were cut. Command posts were buried under rubble. Entire units lost the ability to receive orders before Soviet infantry even appeared. This wasn't about killing every defender. It was about destroying the enemy's ability to function as a coordinated force. German defensive doctrine relied on something specific: rapid local counterattacks. When a position was threatened, reserves would rush forward to seal the breach. Artillery preparation disrupted that timing so completely that reserves arrived late, piecemeal or not at all. After-action reports described frontline units still intact but isolated, deaf and blind. By 1944, Soviet artillery accounted for over half of all German battlefield casualties on the Eastern Front. Tanks gained the fame, but artillery quietly broke resistance before armour ever rolled forward. Once artillery had crushed the surface, the Soviets didn't push everyone forward at once. They committed specialised formations built for one purpose: breaking what remained. Shock armies were permanent purpose-built units designed to attack the strongest sectors of enemy defences. Dense infantry, heavy engineers, direct fire weapons operating on extremely narrow frontages. Their mission wasn't manoeuvre, it was penetration. By 1944, Soviet operational manuals defined success as penetrating 6 to 10 kilometers on the first day, even against prepared defenses. That depth mattered critically. Anything less allowed defenders to seal gaps with reserves. Anything more meant enemy command structures and logistics were already unravelling. During the Vistula Oder Offensive in January 1945, shock armies smashed through German defensive belts in Poland with alarming speed. In some sectors, penetrations exceeded planning estimates within hours. German frontline units were still fighting while their rear headquarters were already under direct threat. The unsettling truth is this: shock armies weren't designed to win through gradual attrition. They imposed a sudden, irreversible condition on defenders. Once the breach existed, the defensive line stopped being a line. It became disconnected fragments. At that point, outcomes weren't determined by bravery or tactical skill. They were dictated by time, depth, and how fast collapse spread outward from the rupture. But here's where Soviet operations became truly lethal. Breaking through was just the beginning. What came next transformed tactical success into strategic annihilation. Once the crust was broken, mobile forces poured through, not to fight, to encircle. And when Soviet encirclements closed, they didn't just trap soldiers. They erased entire formations from existence. Operational encirclement worked because of what followed. Tank and mechanized corps didn't surge forward to duel with enemy armor. That's a misconception that still persists. Soviet tanks were exploitation tools, not breakthrough weapons. Their mission was surgical: drive deep, move fast, and bypass anything that didn't directly threaten the advance. Rail junctions mattered more than Tiger tanks. Supply depots outweighed defensive positions. Headquarters were worth more than entire infantry battalions. The math behind this was unforgiving. A typical Soviet tank corps fielded around 180 to 200 tanks, supported by mechanized infantry, artillery, engineers, and logistics. These formations could operate independently for days. Once German defences fractured, they advanced 40 to 70 kilometres in a single day. During the Vistula Oder Offensive, mechanized forces covered nearly 500 kilometres in just over 3 weeks, reaching the Oder River and collapsing Germany's eastern defensive system almost overnight. Here's what made that devastating. Many German units weren't defeated in combat. They were overtaken by events. Tank losses were anticipated and accepted. Soviet planning assumed heavy attrition, but the calculation was brutal in its clarity. As long as tanks reached operational depth, the damage inflicted on enemy command and logistics outweighed the cost. The T-34 mattered less as an individual machine than as part of a functioning system. Reliability and the ability to keep moving outweighed armour thickness or gun performance. But something else was happening long before tanks ever rolled. Maskirovka. Soviet deception wasn't improvisation. It was a formal, regulated system embedded at every planning level. The goal was straightforward: make the enemy prepare for the wrong battle. Weeks before offensives began, entire formations moved at night. Fake radio traffic simulated armies that didn't exist. Dummy bridges, artillery positions, and supply dumps were constructed in full view of enemy reconnaissance. Real forces hid under camouflage in dispersed forests under strict radio silence. Prior to Bagration, Soviet deception convinced German intelligence the main offensive would hit southern sectors toward Ukraine. German reserves shifted away from Army Group Center, the actual target. When the real attack began, commanders faced a crisis with inadequate forces in the decisive sector. Maskirovka didn't just conceal strength, it distorted time itself. German units reacted days too late, committing reserves after encirclements were already closing. Even accurate reports were dismissed because they contradicted expectations shaped by deception. By 1944, surprise wasn't treated as an advantage, it was a requirement. Yet defence mattered just as much as offence. After Stalingrad, Soviet doctrine evolved. Defence in depth became the standard. Success wasn't measured in ground held, but in time bought. The system absorbed, slowed, and exhausted attackers before destroying them in counterattack. Kursk revealed the full maturity of this approach. Soviet planners constructed defensive belts stretching up to 150 kilometres deep. filled with trenches, anti-tank ditches, and some of the densest minefields in history. Certain sectors contained over 1,500 mines per kilometre. Each layer served a purpose. Forward positions forced early deployment. Secondary belts absorbed the main blow. Deeper lines held mobile reserves and artillery for the decisive moment. German armoured units penetrated initial defences and believed they were succeeding, but every kilometre cost fuel, tanks and momentum. By the time they reached final belts, formations were fragmented, schedules broken, strength drained. Only then did Soviet counterattacks begin. Defence in depth transformed battlefields into controlled attrition machines. Cities presented entirely different challenges. Urban combat shattered assumptions about manoeuvre warfare, streets restricted armour, rubble blocked fields of fire, buildings erased clear front lines. Stalingrad transformed necessity into method. Storm groups built around submachine gunners, engineers and flamethrower teams isolated structures, infiltrated from multiple directions, and eliminated resistance floor by floor. Control was defined strangely. Buildings could be captured while enemies still occupied basements, or lost while friendly forces held upper floors. Combat unfolded vertically as much as horizontally. The strategic effect was profound. Urban fighting neutralized German advantages in coordination and long-range firepower. Every block consumed time, manpower, and morale at unsustainable rates. German soldiers called it rat war because progress was slow, disorienting, and psychologically corrosive. Cities converted space into time and time into collapse. Meanwhile, another war unfolded behind German lines. Partisan warfare wasn't improvised resistance. It was coordinated extension of Soviet operations directed by high command. Railways became primary targets. In Belarus and Ukraine, thousands of coordinated demolitions destroyed tracks, bridges, and signalling systems. During summer 1944 alone, partisan units carried out tens of thousands of rail sabotages, paralysing logistics exactly when major offensives began. Small detachments forced Germany to divert hundreds of thousands of troops to rear security. These soldiers were unavailable at fronts where they were desperately needed. Supply trains arrived late, or not at all. Commanders could no longer rely on secure rear zones. Partisan attacks synchronized with Red Army offensives amplified impact catastrophically. When frontline units attempted withdrawal, rail lines vanished behind them. Retreat became chaos. German formations weren't just pressured from the front, they were hollowed out from behind. Fuel shortages immobilized armour. Ammunition scarcity limited artillery. Units that might have escaped encirclements stalled and disintegrated instead. By the time Soviet armies arrived, resistance was already weakened, fragmented, and exhausted. The war wasn't decided only where soldiers faced each other. It was sealed in forests, villages, and rail junctions where fronts didn't exist, but outcomes were determined. Soviet warfare wasn't about individual brilliance on battlefields. It was about understanding that modern armies were fragile systems held together by invisible threads of communication, supply, and coordination. Cut enough threads simultaneously, and collapse became inevitable. What made this approach so effective wasn't technological superiority or numerical advantage alone. It was the willingness to think about war as something beyond tactical engagements. The Soviets recognized that defeating an enemy meant destroying their ability to function as an organized force. Once that threshold was crossed, resistance didn't fade gradually. It vanished completely, leaving only fragments that could neither retreat nor fight effectively.